Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast, where we talk about everything dog. Q&As with veterinarian professionals, rescue operators, everyday topics. We cover everything dog on this podcast. So make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media on both Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Now here's that next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast. This is your host, Brittany, and we are joined today by Daniel Schulof, the CEO of KetoNatural Pet Foods. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us today.
You're welcome, Brittany. Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. You and I were talking about, we have some commonalities, and you were fortunate enough to leave somewhat the profession of law. So just talk to us about like who you are and kind of what you do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the Venn diagram of like legal background, doggy focus, and keto is pretty small. And so, yeah, I think it's quite a coincidence that we both have those things. So you're right. Used to be a lawyer. I used to litigate cases. So do what you do lawsuits. Over the course of doing that, I really liked it a lot, but it's not a great job too. It's very demanding in some ways. And for that reason, I started indulging my side projects a bit more than maybe my employer would have liked once upon a time. And one of those like got off the ground enough that I could make it my full-time thing, which is doggy stuff. Like I started a dog toy company that was really this like hugely automated passive income thing where I was just making toys for people who had dogs like mine. I had a big Rottweiler. But over the course of doing that, I started writing about my experiences with him. And I kind of got obsessed with the issue of obesity in dogs, which is a super random thing, but is a super huge problem. And long story short, what became a personal passion project for me blossomed into a 4-year book project that I put out in 2016. And the book is called Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma. It explains my viewpoint on why we've got a problem of obesity among pets in the United States, does a bit to highlight how bad the problem is, and makes the case for my view on the subject, which is primarily that carbohydrates are the devil when it comes to obesity, and that if we got carbs out of the food supply for pets, we wouldn't have an obesity problem. And so shortly after I published the book and did all the press for that, I founded a company that's designed to cater to people who share that belief, who either read the book and felt persuaded by it or came to it through their own path. But if if you're looking at that time for a dog food that was low in carbs but wasn't raw, it was hard to find one. And KetoNatural Foods makes products like that. We make kibble products with very low carbohydrate content, which is rare.
So KetoNatural Pet Foods. Now before we kind of dive into the company and kind of what you guys do, one thing I wanted for you to tell the audience about was, what is the keto diet? Because it's not just cream cheese. It's not just fat bombs. It's not just, well, I'm going to eat 17 pieces of Colby Jack today. So I think there's a little bit of missing education on what the ketogenic diet is.
Sure. Yeah. Keto is a shorthand for ketogenic. So the ketogenic diet is a diet that is designed to make you or your dog, as the case may be, produce this metabolic substrate called ketones, ketone bodies. And basically, your body or your dog's body will make them under certain conditions. And over time, the scientific community has gotten better at understanding what those conditions are. And they kind of can be summarized. We know some good ground rules. Number one is eat as little carbohydrate as possible. So it's very common to hear keto diet and think, like you're alluding to, very low carb. That's, in fact, the reason why we call our company KetoNatural Pet Foods is like, I try to make clear to folks, like, we're not really claiming that we'll put your dog into as deep a state of ketosis as possible. If you want to do that, you probably can do more than just feed our diet. But US pet food law is so crazy that you can't call your dog food low carb. You can't use the expression, it's against the law to call your food low carbohydrate.
The one law that I'm aware of that it just doesn't make sense because there are a million other missing laws, but we won't get into that.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, exactly. But no, it's like here's another one that's currently missing, although it's about to change. You like at this moment, I usually often have like a can of Diet Coke right here. I drink a lot of Diet Coke, and like the US FDA's nutrition facts panel is the thing that's on all the human use food products. Well, the doggy equivalent to that, I'm sure you know, is called the guaranteed analysis panel.
Mm-hmm.
And at present, there's no requirement to include carbohydrate content in the guaranteed analysis panel. And moreover, you're actively prohibited from giving total carbohydrate content. So if you make a low carb dog food and you want to just communicate to the customer that that's the main thing about your food, you are kind of out of luck. And I would submit to you that it's by design. And so we use the keto prefix precisely because it says in a lot of ways to people, this is low carb. That's what this is. And so that's basically tangent, I guess. But yes, as you highlighted before, eating a high fat content diet in addition to a low carb one has been shown to deepen ketosis as well, both in dogs and in people. But there are a variety of other things too. So generally, those are the hallmarks: to eat as little carbohydrate as possible, and in addition to kind of increase fat content. And those are the pillars of it. It makes your body produce this stuff that otherwise it is kind of not producing to as significant extent.
Right. So with respect to the food that you guys make, what would you say? And I know now we have to be careful since you can't label. We've got these laws that I had no idea about.
Oh yeah. I mean, you probably know that like as a lawyer, I'm maybe a little more inclined than the average bear to flout the law. So I don't use low carbohydrate on our package, but at the same time, I don't think that I'm doing anything that I'm going to get in trouble for when I tell people that our product is low carbohydrate, because it is.
Right. What is the kind of the main, I guess we'll say, food sources? And it could be protein, could be fat, but what is the makeup of most of your foods? What kind of stands out about you guys with respect to the food that you make?
Yeah, so the carbohydrate content is hugely different from most kibble products and indeed most pet food, commercially sold pet food products. So largely because producers aren't required to tell the customer how much carbohydrate is in their diet, many don't, and many use tons of it. And it's kind of, even if you're not somebody who spends their professional life studying what's healthy for dogs, a lot of folks have a rough sense that like, that's not very natural for a dog to eat a great deal of corn, for instance. I know dog means wolf to a large degree and wolf means meat to a large degree. And so from a very common sense perspective, I think there's a pretty well-established consumer sense that like high protein, high meat, low carbohydrate is kind of what you want. But because of the laws being the way that they are, you can put a wolf on the bag and do a number of other kind of like hide the ball type of tricks and give the consumer the feeling that their product is full of meat and full of protein, when in reality it's 40, 50, 60% dietary carbohydrate. And so while that's the norm, and it's the norm like across the price spectrum too, by the way, like one thing I usually tell folks when I'm trying to help somebody understand what the right food product is for them is I'm like, in the great majority of cases, it doesn't matter if your kibble product is $40 for a large bag or $100 for a large bag, the nutritional profile is going to be real similar. It's going to be in that 30% protein range, 40% carbohydrate range. And at the time we were founded, you could find some that are a bit lower than that, but not really. That like the vast majority were at least 30%. We're less than 6% digestible carbohydrate. And so we are a real outlier. There's one other kibble company that came into being after we were founded that also sells really low carbohydrate kibble. Their product is like a little bit different from ours in terms of the protein and fat content, though. We're both like legitimate outliers from the rest of the kibble world when it comes to carbs, but we're higher protein and lower fat. Theirs is higher fat and lower protein. So our recipes are about, to get around to an answer to your question, 45 to 50% protein, less than 6% dietary carbohydrate, digestible carbohydrate, and something in the high teens for fat percentage, with the rest being made up of fiber, moisture, and ash.
Okay. So, and I want to get into the benefits for dogs of being lower carb, benefits of the keto diet. But before I do that, we have talked about the different laws and we've talked about the other players in this game. And so and we could probably spend 3 hours on this, but let's talk a little bit about the deceptive tactics of the pet food industry. And like you even said before, putting a wolf on the front of the bag, you're like, oh, wow, I bet this is a very healthy, natural, high protein food just by looking at that advertisement. A lot of consumers don't know any better. So, can you talk about some of the tactics, maybe some of the most
Sure.
common tactics?
Yeah. So another one is trying to focus the consumer on an ingredient list as opposed to a nutritional profile.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the reason that, and that's a very common practice in, not on the producer side. I mean, I guess it is common for producers to try to orient their consumers that way, but of course it's very common for consumers. Most pet food consumers, unlike when they're buying foods for themselves, start with the ingredient panel and then, if at all, look at the nutritional profile. And I think that's exactly backwards. I tend to think that ingredients are relevant to the extent that they impact the nutritional profile. But
Mm-hmm.
outside of that, I don't really think there are some reasons I could imagine why somebody would choose one product or one ingredient over another. If it's something about ethics, or if it's something about, there are a few things, I suppose, you could take away from, decouple from nutritional content, but I think it's all about nutritional content. Whereas, and one of the reasons for that, is much harder to hide the ball when you get down to
Mm-hmm.
numbers, but you can hide the ball in the ingredient panel. And so one thing I've actually talked about recently in some other contexts is the practice of what's called ingredient splitting. Ingredient splitting is this common pet food industry thing where what you do is you take your one source of meat, and instead of just regardless of how much meat you use, your goal becomes to use as many different meat ingredients as possible, because then they all have to feature on the list. So, for instance, our chicken recipe of our product, Ketona, is more than 70% chicken, but it's only got chicken in it. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
one, is of course the number one ingredient in the product, but that's it. If you're trying to be sneaky, you might have a list that looks only, say your product is 25% meat. Well, it could still go chicken thigh, chicken breast, chicken liver, turkey breast, and have 30 of these things in a row. And any consumer that is at all like, is like, oh, this clearly looks to me like something that's very meaty. So that's a very common one too. I mean, I could go till the sun comes down. Like there's
Right.
in my judgment, the whole growth of a very popular subsector of the pet food industry, the grain-free market, is a sort of a manifestation of the consumer's desire or understanding that meat is good for their dog and carbohydrate isn't. Like grain-free, it's my belief, arose because it sounds a lot like low carb, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, usually there's a grain of corn with an X across it where it says grain free.
Right.
But in reality, it leaves a loophole that low carb doesn't leave, which is that you can get carbohydrate from other things that aren't grains,
Mm-hmm.
tubers, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. It's like your dog is not eating a great diet if it's eating some small fraction of chicken and then potato chips for the rest of it. But that diet's grain free. And
Right.
so, that's kind of a third way, is you use language to suggest what's not in there, but you leave yourself a loophole to include things that are very bad for the animal, but aren't on your preferred list of like things it's free from.
Mm-hmm. And I think as consumers, especially, I'm going to speak with respect to the United States, we just trust, oh, well, this says it's healthy. It's good, whether it's human food or dog food. And I think I hope people are starting to kind of realize, like, wait a second, just because it has this claim, we had the whole like low fat for people. And then we've had, just these different fads that come in and out, and people buy into those because we're really not educated as a consumer base, especially for our dogs. But I think that as consumers, we kind of fall into these traps, if you will, just mostly lack of education,
Sure.
maybe an unwillingness to learn more, or you don't know what you don't know. Maybe you don't think you need to learn anymore. Oh, well, they've been making pet food 20 years. It's got to be good. It's got to be what my dog needs, like I hear that all the time from
Oh
people.
yeah, of course. It's a, I mean, I would submit, and of course I'm biased, I've written so much about this, but like in my judgment, it's worse in the world of pet food than in a lot of other. It's tough to be a consumer in America, kind of full stop.
Hmm.
But It's very hard to be a smart, conscientious pet food consumer. And a couple of the things that make the industry particularly unique is that there's a great deal of regulatory capture. It's very poorly regulated. It manifests as the very unconsumer friendly, uncommonsensical labeling law and regime that exists more broadly around the labeling law. But it's more than that. It's also the case that there's a great amount of like academic and clinical capture. So the extent to which industry influences the clinical veterinary community and the academic community is on a level in veterinary nutrition that it is not in the human world. Largely because there's just not as much funding available. If you want to study doggy nutrition topics for your career, you cannot do that effectively unless you are independently wealthy and you own a lab on your own, unless you are taking money from industry. Full stop. There's just no NIH funding or, big foundations that are uncoupled from industry partners that provide funding to do good research here. It all comes from industry. Sometimes it gets laundered through other like cutout organizations, but it all comes from there. And as you can imagine, industry, the oil industry doesn't love funding legitimate climate change science. And so there's a lot of topics that don't get studied well in veterinary nutrition for that reason. And clinical practice is almost worse. It's just very hugely influenced by industry. Industry spends a lot of time from the time you enroll in vet school until the day you retire from practice, shaping what veterinarians come to believe about matters of nutrition. And so what it means to be a consumer then, and I hear it, literally daily, is just like, I don't know who to trust. Who am I supposed to rely on? I have my vet telling me something that I can hear on its face doesn't hold water, but they're rock solid confident in it. They must have been taught it. I've got all these internet weirdos doing their own theories about stuff. Do I trust them? Do I trust what's on the bag? And it's all packaged in this like warm and fuzzy pets are the best. We all love our dog's vibe that like belies how gross and swampy it is, like just under the surface. So it's incredibly difficult. I sympathize like to no end with the consumer.
And you're doing your piece. So you, with your book, with your company, you are kind of you're turning that wheel. You're really helping educate people, really helping them kind of understand like, hey, here's the science, here's kind of the studies that I've done. And even if that doesn't change people's mind, it is another route for them learning more, and all you can do is lead the horse to, what's the saying? Lead the horse to the watering hole, but you can't make him drink. So
yeah, exactly. But here's
do so much.
Like the problem though, is like, that's the same language that like you need more. The reality, and I've thought about this issue to no end. I actually started a nonprofit that's called the Pet Food Consumer Rights Council that's trying to do what it can from a nonprofit perspective to try to address some of this as well. But it's like, it's not enough to just be like, I'm going to go out there and tell people what the science really says, because that's literally the exact same message that every other source is providing.
Right.
The truth of the matter, what I honestly believe, is that you're going to continue to have it until consumers really embrace scientific literacy. You don't have to become so good that you could teach a course on nutrition, but you have to be good enough at reading and understanding when somebody makes a scientific claim. You have to be able to go, I know how I can check that to see if they're telling me the truth or not, and run that down on your own at a 101 level through the internet. I don't think until that kind of stuff like reaches widespread acceptance, it's just too easy otherwise. And it's like, unfortunately, it's something that exists in the veterinary community. You have this great deal of like, somebody I trust told me the studies say this, therefore I'm going with that. Yeah. And it's not good enough if you want to get to the truth in this day and age. Too many people are grifters that can take advantage of that kind of situation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of shift. So let's talk about the benefits of the ketogenic diet. And I was telling you prior to starting this episode, I discovered the ketogenic diet for dogs when one of my dogs had cancer. And the way it was represented to me, and I, kind of did my own research, but like you said, it's like, I don't know who to trust. I don't know what to read. is if you could get a dog into ketosis, those ketones can help not only kill the cancer cells, but also perhaps starve them. Or put differently, you are not providing a carbohydrate to feed the cancer cells. And so, that's one of the many benefits. And I know you've got a whole list of them. So let's run through like some of the benefits of it.
I'll do that, and I'll try to give your listeners my sense, at least, of how strong the evidence is for any one of these individual applications.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is the one I know the most about, which is body composition and obesity. More than half of the dogs in the United States today are overweight or obese. Okay. So I've never met your dog. I know you told me you have a bodybuilding background. So I kind of doubt that this analogy or this example will hold in your case. That said, usually when I'm on an interview, I go, look, I never met your dog, but if I were forced to bet, I would bet that your dog is overweight or obese. Those are the odds. It's more, the next dog you see on the street is more likely to be overweight or obese than not. Fact number one. Fact number two is that being just moderately overweight, so not like colossal whatever, but just moderately, something that many people probably wouldn't even recognize as overweight, is worse for a dog than a lifetime from the time you're 18 of smoking is for a person. So in a world where we're all very rightly obsessed with doing everything we can to keep our dogs around for as long as possible, the one thing that definitely moves the needle, like more than any fringe issue, is keep your dog really lean. Keep your dog really lean, and you will improve its lifespan on the average by a huge extent, like 20%. So for me, that issue is hugely important. I'm almost a one-issue shopper around that directly. Carbohydrate has been shown at least a half dozen different times to be more fattening for dogs and cats, calorie for calorie, than other nutrients. So in the world of human nutrition, you've probably seen yourself, tons of vociferous debate between dietary camps. There are some folks who believe that carbs make you fat. There are other folks who believe a calorie is a calorie, and the two camps are in all likelihood never going to come to any kind of see the world the same way. And one of the reasons is because the kind of study that teases that issue out very definitively is hard to do with people, which is you take two groups, you keep their lifestyles exactly the same in every possible way. You feed them exactly the same number of calories every day, but you just change one thing, the amount of carbohydrate. Everything else you keep the same. And it's hard to do because people don't like that. You don't want to live in what's called a metabolic ward. You're not good at tracking every calorie that comes into your face. You want to eat different foods, et cetera, et cetera. And so that type of evidence is notoriously lacking in the human world. But in the doggy world, it's super easy. It's real easy to just like, dog eats the same thing every day. They are often held in laboratory conditions for a long enough period where you can evaluate their body composition. And so it's been done a half dozen different times, what they call isocaloric feeding trials, where you feed two groups exactly the same number of calories, but one gets more carbohydrate, one gets less carbohydrate. You look at what happens to their bodies. Every single time that it has been done, the same thing happened to the animals' bodies, which is the dogs that ate the same number of calories but fewer carbohydrates got less fat, didn't get fat. The dogs that ate the same number of calories but more carbohydrate got fat. And so for me, if you do not have carbohydrate in the animal's diet, I have yet to see a single example of somebody who has been managed to make a dog become overweight without feeding carbohydrate. It's my view from as I sit here right now, you literally cannot make a dog overweight unless you feed it carbohydrate. So anti-obesity, body composition, number one. Cancer, I would say, is the second most popular reason why people tend to choose low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets for their pets. And I would suggest to you that that one is often more about the extent of the problem than the extent of the quality of the evidence. There is some scientific basis for the idea that reducing carbohydrate intake, improving the ketogenic qualities of a diet will help with cancer outcomes in dogs and cats, but it's limited. There's a very clean theory, and you hit it. It's like tumors preferentially burn glucose, which is the byproduct of carbohydrate ingestion. And so take the glucose out, keep my blood sugar as low as possible. I'm going to starve a tumor. Very clean theory. The evidence isn't like super compelling, honestly. It's some folks think that there's some don't, but the problem is so significant and it's so acute. You know, I've had dogs die of cancer too, and it's the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, you go grasping for, well, I'll do whatever I can to move the needle in the right direction. And so that's why I think you see a relatively significant amount of study around that issue. The evidence is okay. It's in my judgment, it's something that's worth doing for that reason alone. But people could disagree about that. If you were, for some odd reason, like, I don't care about body composition, I just care about cancer, maybe you would do that, but it's somewhat. Third disease application is another like 10 out of 10 evidence one, but it's a crazy one, which is diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
In the pet world, it used to be the case that dogs never, like, very rarely got diabetes. It's now insanely common. And I would submit to you that the very easy explanation for that is that carbohydrate is now the backbone of the US pet food system. And that the most common prescription only diets for treatment of diabetes in dogs and in cats are, it makes me almost gag saying it, 40% digestible carbohydrate. So if your dog has diabetes, what that means, for those of your listeners that don't understand that disease, means their body can't process carbohydrate. It means that their body doesn't make enough of the hormone insulin, which is what's needed to prevent the carbohydrate in your body from becoming reaching high poisonous levels. Glucose becomes poisonous at certain high levels. And in a functioning body, you produce this hormone insulin, it makes it all go away, you're all good. Diabetic people can't produce enough of it. So you can do two things. You can reduce the amount of glucose coming in, or you can supplement the amount of insulin that they have. And in the dog and kitty world, it's very common to supplement insulin. Anyone who has a pet that's listening to this with diabetes knows that you give it insulin shots, exogenous insulin shots, to make it what it needs. But at the same time, of course, you're going to reduce the carbohydrate content as much as possible. Nope. If you go to your veterinarian and say, give me a prescription only food for my dog with diabetes, 40% digestible carbohydrate, Hill's metabolic. It's scandalous. So those are just three of the things that pop to mind as like the disease applications with significant evidentiary backing. But it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. Like, it's like, this as a dietary thing, carbs for dogs, is like, from a genetic evolutionary perspective, is a super new thing. In my book, like, my research for the book, like, kind of began, I went to Yellowstone National Park, where there are biologists who study gray wolves in the wild for the Yellowstone Wolf Project. It's the premier place for the study of wolves in the US. And they will tell you that until the dog-wolf genealogical tree split about 10 or 15,000 years ago, none of them had ever consumed even 1 gram of dietary carbohydrate. This stuff has been in their lives very recently, only very recently. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that it happens to correspond with the least healthy period in the animal's genetic history. So,
yeah. All right. So tell us where everyone can find your book. Tell us where everyone can find the pet food. Just go ahead, plug away all of the different websites, social media.
Okay. Again, my name is Daniel Schulof. My book is called Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma, and you can buy it in any of the big places that you buy books. My company that I founded shortly after I published the book is called KetoNatural Pet Foods. You can find our products basically anywhere on the internet that you buy pet food, Amazon, Chewy, Petco, and our own website, which is www.ketonaturalpetfoods.com. If you go there, though, you will also get a ton of good information. Like this is a 20-minute version of something that you could spend the rest of your fall on, just on our website if you want it. There's an abundance of, I like to think it's the best library on the internet for free information about veterinary nutrition topics. And there's just a ton of reading to be done there. So if you're like, oh, this is compelling, I'm not ready to buy this guy's pitch, I would encourage you to read more, and you can start there. It links out to a million other things. Social media, I'm a Twitter person. My handle is @Daniel Schulof, but I'm transitioning. I think I'm going to Blue Sky. I don't know if that means anything, but I'm like in the midst of that transition, but I'm not a hugely active producer on social media anyway. Our blog and my book are the best ways to kind of, or excuse me, our website and my book are kind of the best ways for folks to learn more. But I answer emails directly. So if anybody, you can find how to contact us on the company website. And I love it talking to people about these kind of things. So don't be a stranger to anyone that's interested in this stuff.
All right, Daniel. Well, thank you so much for being on tonight. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Brittany, thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Canine Culture Podcast. Please make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media. If you have any recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear, if you know of any guests that would be good for the show, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please reach out to us. Send us an email at canineculturepodcast@gmail.com, or send us a direct message on social media. Thank you for listening, and please share this with any of your dog-loving friends.